Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're interested in global politics, history, and the mechanics of power, then you're in for a treat today. We're diving into one of the most eye-opening books on international relations, Noam Chomsky's Who Rules the World. This book explores the hidden forces shaping global power dynamics, and it's a must-read if you're looking to understand the intersection of empire, economics, and military might. Stick around as we break down some of Chomsky's most compelling arguments. Let's get started. In Who Rules the World, Noam Chomsky tackles a fundamental question of our time: who really controls the world? With his characteristic rigor and sharp analysis, Chomsky peels back the layers of political power and exposes the forces that shape international relations. Drawing on decades of expertise as a linguist and political activist, Chomsky doesn't just ask who holds power, but also examines the moral and ethical dimensions of that power, particularly in relation to the United States' global dominance. The book takes a critical look at the United States as the predominant global empire. While many view the U.S. as a democratic beacon of freedom, Chomsky argues that its policies, particularly in the post-Cold War era, have often prioritized its own strategic interests over the well-being of other nations. For Chomsky, the question of who rules the world isn't just about who holds the reins of power but how power is used to maintain and extend control. The U.S., he contends, operates less as a democratic nation and more as a hegemonic empire, using military might, economic policies, and covert operations to shape the world in its image. One of the key themes Chomsky addresses is the idea of American exceptionalism. In the U.S., there's a widespread belief that the country is fundamentally different from other empires in history, that it is a force for good in the world. Chomsky dismantles this narrative, pointing out how the U.S. has repeatedly intervened in foreign countries, often with disastrous consequences, under the guise of spreading democracy. From Latin America to the Middle East, Chomsky highlights how U.S. interventions have been driven by economic and geopolitical interests, rather than humanitarian concerns. The book also delves into the role of the U.S. military-industrial complex, which has become one of the most powerful forces in shaping both domestic and foreign policy. Chomsky argues that this complex, comprising defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and military leaders, has an outsized influence on the decisions made in Washington, often pushing the country into unnecessary wars and conflicts. Through its actions, the U.S. has maintained a vast network of military bases around the world, with a footprint in nearly every corner of the globe, from Europe to the Pacific to Africa. This global military presence serves not only to protect American interests but also to enforce them. Central to Chomsky's critique is the idea that the U.S. operates in a way that benefits a small elite, both domestically and abroad. He critiques the concentration of wealth and power within a few corporations and individuals, drawing parallels between the structure of the American economy and the structure of imperialism. In this view, the U.S. government, driven by corporate interests, uses its power to create an international order that benefits its corporations, often at the expense of poorer nations. The massive wealth gap within the U.S. itself, along with the disproportionate influence of the rich, is reflected in how America's policies are enacted globally. Chomsky also discusses the concept of the empire of capital, describing how American multinational corporations, alongside the government, impose neoliberal economic policies on developing countries. These policies often come in the form of trade agreements, debt relief programs, and structural adjustment policies from organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. While these organizations claim to help stabilize economies, Chomsky argues that they instead further entrench poverty and inequality, creating a system where wealth is extracted from the global south to benefit the global north. These actions, he claims, are a modern form of imperialism, conducted through economic means rather than outright military occupation. Chomsky doesn't just critique the U.S., he also highlights how other world powers, like China and Russia, have risen in prominence, often emulating the U.S.'s imperialist tactics. While the U.S. continues to hold significant sway in international organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, and NATO, Chomsky argues that these structures often serve the interests of the U.S. and its allies, rather than offering a truly multilateral approach to global governance. The U.S., in this sense, sets the rules of the international order and frequently uses its influence to ensure that those rules benefit its own power. A significant part of Chomsky's argument revolves around the role of the media in perpetuating the status quo. He explores how the mainstream media in the U.S. often serves as a mouthpiece for elite interests, shaping public perception to align with the policies and goals of the state and its corporate partners. By focusing on certain issues and ignoring others, the media creates a narrative that supports U.S. hegemony and keeps the public unaware or disengaged from the deeper, often more troubling, realities of global politics. Chomsky also makes the case that despite the U.S.'s overwhelming global influence, there are numerous challenges to its rule. Resistance movements around the world, from the Arab Spring to grassroots activism in Latin America, have begun to push back against American dominance. Additionally, the rise of new economic powers like China and India presents a shift in the global order, leading Chomsky to question how the U.S. will maintain its position in an increasingly multipolar world. The unipolar world that followed the Cold War, where the U.S. stood alone as the dominant superpower, is slowly being replaced by a more complex and contested international landscape. Chomsky argues that the future of global governance will likely involve more competition between great powers, each seeking to assert their influence over key regions and resources. However, this competition often comes at a high human cost, especially for those living in countries where war, exploitation, and environmental destruction are the most visible outcomes of imperial policies. Chomsky calls for a global rethinking of the current system, advocating for more equitable, peaceful, and cooperative forms of international relations. At its core, Who Rules the World? Is a call to action. Chomsky believes that ordinary people around the world have the power to challenge the prevailing global order. By fostering greater awareness, solidarity, and political engagement, he suggests that we can build a more just and sustainable world. The book ends on a note of cautious optimism, urging readers to recognize that while the forces of empire are formidable, they are not invincible. Ultimately, Who Rules the World? Is both a critique and a challenge, a critique of the existing global power structures and a challenge to all of us to question how power works and to take action in the fight for a fairer, more democratic world. Chomsky's analysis is a sobering reminder that the world we live in today is the product of historical forces shaped by imperial ambition, but it is also a world that can be transformed through collective action and resistance. If you found Chomsky's exploration of global power dynamics insightful, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more discussions on political analysis and world affairs. See you in the next video, and remember, understanding who rules the world is the first step toward changing it.